Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Pete Ross, and joining me today is our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. James, let's get right into it. Over recent days, a flurry of mixed messages about the US-Iran ceasefire. First, Donald Trump said a deal had been largely negotiated. Then he said he was in no rush for a deal. And then on Monday, US attacks on Iran. So what's going on?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that in any negotiation, we should always be cautious before accepting the word of either side as an accurate predictor of intentions, whereas actually quite often what they're trying to do is inject momentum or actually deceleration into negotiation. So look, we should always have a pinch of salt with what's been said about it. That said, clearly they have made some progress. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, says, look, there is some alignment now on some of the issues, but it's going to take a few days for a deal to be agreed. So clearly there is some kind of, possible outline there. But as you say, this latest round of US strikes perhaps might make that more complicated. The fact that the Iranians are now saying we reserve the right to retaliate, and they claim they've already shot down an American drone, means that sort of, gives a degree of extra complication to these discussions.
Do we know specifically what stage we're at now, though, what they're talking about? Because I think some of the major sticking points still remain. The Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear capabilities. Do we know anything about the finer details? Perhaps is it a prolonged ceasefire, something like that? Anything at all?
Well, first of all, we don't know the precise details because both sides are being pretty enigmatic about it. They are leaking bits and bobs to various local media. Essentially, where we're at the moment is a question of sequencing. In other words, what we're talking about is essentially agreeing a deal that is called a memorandum of understanding. In other words, a broad statement of principles, which would sort of say, look, we agree to end the war. There's going to be an extension of the ceasefire for however many days. And under the terms of that ceasefire, Iran would allow shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The US would lift its blockade of Iranian ports. And then a whole bunch of issues would be shoved down the line and parked for future negotiation. Now, what's not been agreed and what's not clear is precisely what are they going to agree in the framework here, and what are they going to park and leave for later, and what commitments are there made and promises are there made between the first stage and the second phase. So in other words, it's not just a question or a disagreement of substance here. It's also a question about sequencing and timing.
And do we think these latest attacks from both sides, as we understand it, are going to have any effect on that at all?
Well, look, this ceasefire's been in place for some time now. It's always been a pretty fragile ceasefire. It has survived previous breaches by both sides, where both sides alleged the other side breached the truce. So I think it's likely that this truce will survive, not least because both sides have an incentive for this deal to happen. The American side is under huge political pressure to get a deal. But equally, the Iranians are under huge economic pressure to get a deal as well. So I think at the moment, yes, there will be a certain amount of rhetoric and noise around this. But I think at the moment, my expectation is that the talks at least will continue.
And what role might the Abraham Accords play in all this? Because Donald Trump has said recently that he wants more countries in the Middle East to sign up to this as part of a deal. Do you think that's in this latest round of negotiations, or is it something that might be further down the road?
These things, the Abraham Accords, were agreed back in 2020, which essentially was a deal that Donald Trump and his team helped broker between various countries, in particular the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, essentially to normalize their relations with Israel. Now, our understanding is that during some of the conversations that Donald Trump had with Gulf leaders over the weekend, he suddenly laid out of nowhere this demand that he said was mandatory, that they had to sign up to this accord as well. So we're talking the Saudis, we're talking, the Egyptians, the Turks, the Jordanians, all of these countries. Now, all the indirect reporting we're getting is that this was met with a certain degree of silence. My interpretation of this is, look, the likelihood of the Abraham Accords coming into play here is very low, given that for most of these countries, these Arab countries, the price for normalizing relations with Israel is substantial progress on the Palestinian issue, not more attacks on Gaza, not more settlements in the West Bank. So I think it's unlikely to make progress. What some analysts are inferring is that the White House is just looking for anything that it can claim as some kind of a victory as it tries to exit this war.
And what about what's going on in Washington and political pressure on Donald Trump? I mean, Trump wants to present some sort of, as you say, victory here, but he's getting a lot of pressure from on his side as well, from Republicans within the House as well, is he not?
Yeah, I mean, look, the American policy of tackling Iran was for many, many years bipartisan. It's no longer bipartisan. There is open disagreement on many fronts, with as you say, even Republicans coming out and saying, look, there is a real risk here now that what happens is the Americans withdraw from this conflict and leaving the situation worse than it was when it began. The worst case scenario would be, for example, Iran, a regime left in place, a regime that feels more confident because it's engaged in war with the United States and it's survived. It's come out the other side. It has this new weapon called the Strait of Hormuz that is now there forever and a day. Iran now knows that something that was implicit is now explicit. Potentially, it could see the lifting of some sanctions, which potentially would not just ease its economic burden, but would allow Iran, in theory, to start funding its proxy militias, Hamas, Hezbollah, organizations like that in the region. All the while, its ballistic missile program, yes, has been dented by the American and Israeli attacks, but it still remains and it's still live. And I think there are some Americans who are looking at that potential scenario and thinking, this is not a good option.
And one other thing that's further complicating the issue, I guess, is what's going on in Lebanon. The Israeli attacks there, which they say are in response to attacks from Hezbollah. That's obviously complicating these negotiations as well, I would have thought. Yeah,
I mean, look, although the negotiations are largely between the US and Iran, but through the Pakistanis, the Israelis are concerned. Because they are concerned, that, as I just mentioned, that potentially Iran could come out of this stronger and more confident. Secondly, they are worried that their fight against Hezbollah will be caught up in any peace deal because the Iranians are making it very, very clear that they see peace in the region as a whole as part of the deal, not just between Iran and the United States. So they want the Israelis to agree a ceasefire as part of this deal, which the Israelis are very, very reluctant to do. So I think that there's an awful lot of concern in Israel about the way this war is going. And again, there's not unanimity there. There are some who believe that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has got Israel into a worse place than it was. But there are others who are saying, no, you need to keep this war going. And that's why some are suggesting that the Israelis are stepping up their attacks in Lebanon while they can before a wider deal is agreed.
A very complicated picture, but what happens next?
Well, I think the talks will continue because, as I say, the underlying fundamental is that both sides ultimately want to get a deal here. But both sides are looking for something that they can claim is seen as a victory, and that's true of most of these negotiations. At some point, I think the economic pressures will bite even further. The economic pressure on Iran to do a deal, because the American blockade, is causing a lot of difficulty to the Iranians. But equally, I think that the scale of the economic pressure will transfer into political pressure in Washington that will make the Americans think, which is where they're heading, that a bad deal is better than no deal.
Thanks, James. Our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. And if you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, click the link below.